You may find this controversial, but most non-profit financial risk has nothing to do with the money. I believe from my experience that it has everything to do with decisions made without clarity, or that are not made in a timely manner, or decisions that are made with skewed financial information. And after nearly 2 decades of working in nonprofit finance, across donor-funded projects, across multi-country operations, global organizations, I can tell you with certainty that non-profits do not always go into the pit because the numbers are wrong. They struggle because the numbers arrive too late sometimes, or the numbers are too shallow, or the numbers are disconnected from strategy. And so today, I want to try to unpack what is most misunderstood about non-profit organizations' financial risk, especially by boards, executives, and even sometimes by funders. So here is the first major misunderstanding. So people always assume that if our books are clean and the audit is unqualified, then we are low risk. That sounds logical, yes, but it's dangerously incomplete if you look at it in the full spectrum. Audits will tell you whether your history is accurate. They don't tell you whether your future is secure. So I've seen organizations with clean audits, reconciled balances, and strong compliance ratings. And yet, one delayed grant nearly shut them down, or one donor exit actually triggered multiple layoffs, or even one bad quarter forced program cuts with a major margin. But why? Why should that be the case? I believe it's because risk lives between reporting periods. It lives in cash timing, it lives in funding concentration, it lives in commitments made ahead of funding, and I also believe that it lives in cost structures that don't necessarily flex when revenue flows. So yeah, clean books are necessary and it is a requirement, but more often than not, they are not sufficient. So the second misunderstanding that I can talk about is that people think non-profit financial risk equals to fraud or misappropriation. Yes, controls matter, and I talked about controls earlier in one of my videos. Yes, segregation of duties matters, and I have spoken about segregation of duties and its importance even in small teams. But in my experience, fraud is rarely where destabilization happens. It will bring destabilization because of the reputational damage. Yes, that's given, but the real risks are quieter and actually more common. First, let's talk about strategic risk. So growing programs without sustainable funding, the anxiety to go into the growth spectrum without actually seeing how sustainable the funding is. Then there's the operational risk. One person holding all financial knowledge, and that happens when there is no clarity in the way systems are set. And in my organizational framework method, I've talked about how the 4 pillars of financial sustainability says clarity, reporting systems, internal controls, outward reporting, and also sustainability mechanisms. And then compliance risk. So misunderstanding donor restrictions. So if you are misaligned in terms of the restrictions, especially if you are having highly restricted grants, and you are misaligned in the compliance that these funders are requiring, then definitely you are running a compliance risk there, and you are probably going to end up with unallowed costs, which then you have to absorb, and or until you if you don't have reserves or admin admin funds that can absorb an disallowed cost, then you can see how that risk is glaring at you. And of course, then there's the reputational risk when financial narratives to funders are weak. So these risks, unfortunately, they don't announce themselves loudly. They whisper until suddenly they don't. So reporting deadlines, how they now start really showing this risk is that you find that reporting deadlines are missed. Then you find that funders start asking sharper questions. They start digging in because the reports are just misaligned. Something does not look well on the surface. Then because we are now operating in a crisis, leadership decisions feel rushed. They're just quickly making decisions to keep going without having all the necessary information and consideration that they may probably have needed to have made before that decision is taken. And so finance becomes reactive instead of strategic. And this is not a control failure, because in such organizations you may find that internal controls are working, they have policies, and they maybe are following them, but then there's just the lack of clarity around everything. So number 3 dangerous belief is that the donor carries the risk, we're just implementing. That's not how it works in practice, especially for restricted grants, because in restricted grants, especially in organizations that you find the restricted grants is not properly designed in a manner that even if it's restricted, we know it could be restricted, but it's not covering the whole cost of the organization. And so in designing and accepting this fund, the organization has not taken into consideration that there is a co-funding required, and probably they have taken the funds hoping that they are going to bring in the co-funding, and then the co-funding doesn't come in as had been anticipated during proposal development or even the grant signing. And so you find that there is heaviness, there is a struggle in execution. So there's a risk of execution, there is risk of compliance, and also risk of delivery in how this grant is run. So directly, this organization finds itself in a crisis of cash flow pressure, reporting complexity, and also delivery inflexibility. And this is now where it starts saying out loud that the organization absorbs the risk long before the money arrives, because you've already subscribed to something that even as you start already has execution risk staring at you. So for example, you find that you've already hired staff even before the disbursements are clear. You've already started doing your pre-financing activities, and then the funds delay, and then even your co-funding does not arrive as much as you had anticipated. So this is a financial risk, whether it shows up on a budget or not. The 4th one is the reserves. Let's talk about these reserves, because this is one that quietly destroys organizations. Reserves means inefficiency and lack of mission commitment. Some people believe that that is true, but that belief is wrong. Reserves are not idle money. In fact, in one of my conversations with a CEO, we were talking about creating a reserve, and he was challenging me that why should we keep the money if the money can continue our mission today? And so we really had to sit down and break it down on why, even as an organization, if we are strategically implementing our mission, then reserve becomes an unnegotiable part of our organizational growth. So I was able to convince them that reserves are not idle money, and it's not a mission drift, and it's not poor planning. They are shock absorbers, they are decision buffers, and they are signals of credibility. So organizations without reserves don't fail dramatically. They actually fail slowly. They make decisions like, accepting underfunded grants, delaying critical hires, cutting systems instead of inefficiencies, and prioritizing survival over impact. So that's not discipline, that's actually vulnerability. So the hard question usually comes at why didn't finance flag it? Because everything else, once it gets messy, we have to look for someone to blame. So it will always come like, why didn't finance flag it? Finance cannot flag a risk that has not been asked to analyze in most cases. If leaders are only asking about budgets versus actual spend rates and audit updates, they will never see the scenario stress tests. They will never see the grant dependency ratios. They will never see the liquidity timelines, and they will never see the cost recovery gaps. So risk is invisible when these questions are shallow. Strong organizations don't just ask, are we within the budget? They actually go ahead and ask, what happens if this funding delays by 90 days? Which programs would struggle first? What decisions becomes impossible without reserves? Or where are we over-relying? And so, here is what I think. The real truth about non-profit financial risk is about clarity, timing, and decision discipline. The most resilient non-profits I know are not the ones with the most funding. They are the ones that see risk early, talk about it plainly, integrate finance into strategy, and treat their CFOs or their directors of finance as partners and not as reporters. Because when finance sits at the strategy table, not just at the audit meeting, risk becomes manageable. So I will leave you with this. If your nonprofit feels financially stable, but cash always feels tight, decisions feels reactive, and leadership avoids financial conversations, that's not stability. That's actually unpriced risk looking at you. Strong organizations is not about control. It's about confidence in decision making, and that is the difference between organizations that merely survive and those that remain fundable, credible, and impactful over time. So if you like this content, if you resonate to this video, then I invite you to subscribe and also share with other non-profit leaders so that we can learn and grow together as we build the industry in financial reporting credibility. Thank you.